Well, good morning, almost afternoon. It's great to be here, and I want to start off with acknowledging on behalf of Comcast and my colleagues who are here, Delilah Wilson Scott and Gwyneth Gall, how much we are committed to BEA and to supporting BEA's work. And we also share a commitment to achieving digital equity. It is incredibly important to our corporation and to our customers and to the communities we serve. And as we've had all this discussion about, of course, the importance of achieving economic equity, we are convinced that you can't achieve economic equity and mobility without achieving digital equity, so they go hand in hand. So I'm really honored by being asked to introduce this next session. It's a matter of personal privilege for me in that I have known Eric Holder for 3 decades now. We have been friends and soul brothers throughout that period. We were also colleagues in the Clinton and Obama administrations, and also colleagues at the law firm Covington and Burling, where Eric is, I'd say, the most esteemed partner in the firm. He is just such an incredible lawyer and leader. In Eric's most recent position of leadership, he is the head of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, fighting in the courts and in the legislatures across this country against racial and partisan gerrymandering. I also know Eric, though, as an incredible, wonderful father and husband. Some would say, though, that both Eric and I both married up. I'll leave it to Eric to say that for himself. With regard to me, though, my wife, Michelle Norris, is here, and you will hear from her later, and you will understand that, in fact, it's true that I married way up. I'm proud of that. Eric, of course, is married to the great doctor and author Sharon Malone. Joining the 82nd Attorney General of the United States in this important conversation is award-winning journalist Errin Haines, founding mother and editor-at-large for the 19th. Please welcome these two great leaders to the stage.
Hello, everyone.
Good morning. Whoa, these chairs go way down.
These chairs go way down. Thank you so much for that introduction, Broderick, and welcome, Mr. Attorney General. It is very urgent, it seems, to be having this conversation with you today, so let's just get right into it.
Okay.
You are one of the nation's leading experts on the subject of democracy, and democracy, as we have seen, is under sustained attack. One key element of that attack is the assault on voting rights, and now that I want to talk about new data that's been released by the Brennan Center for Justice that illustrates clearly efforts to restrict the vote are making a real and serious impact on the franchise. I want to ask you, how does this echo or differ from similar attacks that we have seen in the past?
You know, it's interesting. I think they're all part of a continuum. We've always seen from Reconstruction through the Civil Rights Movement to where we are today, attempts to keep certain people away from the polls. And obviously that means Black people away from the polls. Yeah. And I think that is both alarming and comforting in the sense that these efforts have been successful for a while, but almost inevitably, there is the ability, because Black folks have committed themselves, dedicated themselves, given their lives, so that we would ultimately be successful and be full participants or get closer to being full participants in our democracy. That Brennan Center study is really interesting. It shows that the Black-white participation rates in terms of voting are whites always vote at a higher rate than Blacks, but we have seen that gap lengthen since the Shelby County decision in 2013. And we've seen it double in those states that were previously covered under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that the Shelby County decision, stopped the Justice Department from monitoring what was going on in those states.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely something that was alarming for me reading that report, that rate doubled in the years since Shelby. You've been trying to ring the alarm, for more than a decade since that crucial decision. This is an intentional and organized assault on voting rights on all fronts, and it requires us to respond on all fronts. So Can you discuss the NRDC's approach or successes, including the corporate sector's role in really speaking out against voting restrictions, particularly targeting the Black community?
Yeah, NDRC, we've really focused on the problem of gerrymandering, racial and partisan gerrymandering, because the reality is you can put in place these voter suppression laws, and if people are willing to stand in line, if people are willing to go through all the things they have to do to fill out forms, get necessary photo ID, you can overcome those things.
Yeah.
But you can't overcome a really well-designed gerrymander. Doesn't matter how good your candidates are, doesn't matter what the policies that you are trying to espouse, a gerrymander can't be really overcome. And so what we've been trying to do in the states that we have targeted is to bring lawsuits where that's appropriate, put in place these independent commissions to draw the lines, and then to just raise people's consciousness about the negative impact that racial and partisan gerrymandering has. But we've got to fight on a whole bunch of fronts. It's not only about dealing with the structural things like gerrymandering. It's also about voter suppression, and then also getting people enthused about participating in our democracy. What gets me when I hear people say, "Well, my vote doesn't count." It's like, really? If your vote didn't count, why the hell do you think that they're doing so much to get you, prevent you from voting? And then beyond that, as African Americans, I think not participating in our democracy by not voting, you are dishonoring the legacy of people who, as I said, struggled, committed themselves, gave their lives so that we would have the ability to do that which they did not, which was to participate in this democracy as any American citizen would. So you dishonor the past, you create a vacuum in the present for other people to decide what the policies will be in this nation. And then you also are turning your back on the future by not participating in our democracy. And the most basic way to do that is to vote. Now, corporations, I think, have an obligation as well to be involved as good citizens, good corporate citizens, in trying to make sure that our system is fair. And that's, at NDRC, that's all that we want. Just make it fair. If you make it fair, progressives, Democrats will do just fine. Just make it fair.
Yeah, well, I can really hear the sense of urgency in your voice. Certainly folks from your generation, folks from my generation who...
I'm not that old.
I'm not calling you seasoned. I'm saying that you are...
my generation is like,
Yes, nobody's calling you an elder, Attorney General Elder. The point I'm trying to make...
I'm still a young brother here,
No, but I mean, look, there are a lot of people even in the audience too who grew up being influenced by the legacy of the civil rights generation, understanding that there were people who did make those sacrifices. There are younger voters. I know certainly people like my niece who that's not necessarily a case that is working as effectively for them.
And what they need to understand, this is interesting because the point you raise is a really, really important one. Young people now make up the largest voting bloc in this country, and yet my generation, my generation, the baby boomers, we have more power than they do because we vote in greater numbers. A greater proportion of baby boomers vote than young people. And so if young folks, newly energized by a whole variety of issues, I think, will channel that energy into voter participation, we can stop in a lot of places and in a lot of ways these threats to our democracy. And we need to really understand that our democracy is at risk. Simply because it has been this way for close to 250 years doesn't mean it's going to stay this way. You saw the rise of authoritarian regimes in Europe in the 20th century, communism, fascism, not because they were strong, but because the defense of democracy was weak. And doesn't mean we'll have a dictator here in the United States, but you could render meaningless our elections every 2, 4, 6 years unless we defend our democracy, and we have to do it in a whole range of ways.
Yeah, and I so appreciate you talking about this in terms of the global framework, because there are other countries that are looking to us as the country that has been the leader on democracy, taking their cues, good or bad, as to what we are doing here and acting accordingly with their democracies. So as we're seeing these attacks on the right to vote, we're also seeing a backlash to DEI. So I want to talk about that. Right. What is the connection there? How are these attacks similar? And what do we need to do to respond to both of them?
Yeah, I mean, it's all part of a piece, I think. When DEI gets attacked, it's now something that is politically salient. The other side says, well, it's always about them and us. And them is always, it's people of color, it's women, very frequently, as you know, very well with the work that you've done at the 19th. And so we have to understand that if we're going to be fighting on the democracy front, the fight for DEI is really a part of the same battle. This notion that somehow or other DEI as I've seen attacks on DEI where they said, all right, that the bridge that was struck in Baltimore, that was as a result of DEI.
Yeah.
The plane window that fell off that Alaska Airlines plane, that was a result of DEI. And I'm going, wait, what?
No.
But that's the kind of mentality that these folks have. And what we need to push back with is, there's not a tension between excellence and diversity. There's not a tension there. And the polls, if you look at the polls, people, if you don't use the term DEI and describe what DEI is, people at about 65% rate say, well, yeah, that makes the workplace better. Companies that have, in surveys that I've seen, have said, about 80% of them say, even after the Supreme Court affirmative action decision, that they're recommitting themselves to, to DEI efforts. I mean, DEI is about equality of opportunity, doing away with nepotism and all kinds of, old boy networks, things that have kept certain people, certainly people of color disproportionately, but also women, people of different sexual orientations, not giving them the opportunity. I'm not talking about a guaranteed result. I'm just talking about a guarantee of equal opportunity, and then we just see how people do.
You're making such a good point about the language that we are using. I mean, not just using the shorthand of DEI, right? Like that kind of alphabet soup that folks who are not interested in making our democracy, our society more free, fair, and equal can use as a shorthand to just, basically code it.
Yeah, it's like that Jesse Helms ad that he ran against Harvey Gantt, So the hand crumpling up a piece of paper, you're not going to get the job because affirmative action gave it to somebody who was, less qualified. There's a whole bunch of euphemisms that they hear. They're not using the N word, but that's what's really going on here. This is about, you don't want them. You talk about, forced busing in a different age, and now we talk about DEI, but it's really all about, this is the thing that America never really wants to confront, our racial past, and our racial present. It's as if, when I hear the Supreme Court justices say, well, DEI, voter protection should only last for, a set number of years. Like, okay, when are you going to start the clock? It's all right, with the clock, 1965, that's when the Voting Rights Act was passed. But I mean, we won cases in Alabama and Louisiana last year.
Right.
When it came.
In places where supposedly this was no longer an issue.
I mean, with this Supreme Court saying that what, they did in Alabama with regard to racial gerrymandering was inconsistent with the Voting Rights Act. Now, that was 2023. So, okay, we start the clock there. So, when Kavanaugh and these other justices is talking about, limited amounts of time, got to end at some point. All right, well, you tell them to stop. You want me to stop, you tell the other side to stop.
And to your point, I mean, I think what we are seeing is that, there is a very coordinated, a very organized effort, for folks who are opposed to the expansion of rights, right? To the expansion of equality in this country, that is related to DEI, that's related to voting rights, that's related to access to reproductive care. This is a playbook that we're seeing that is all very connected, and yet we're not seeing kind of the counter response to that for folks who are in support of those things. We know what the playbook is, and yet where is the I guess kind of the equal response to that? Why is that not happening if we know what's going to happen?
Well, I think it is happening. It's not happening in the same way that perhaps it happened, during the civil rights movement, where you have the charismatic leader or the charismatic organizations. But I think as I've gone around the country, there are lots of grassroots movements, people not getting necessarily national attention, who I think are being pretty effective in pushing back. But I think it's going to depend on all of us, and especially people like the people in this room. Leaders, people who have access to power, who have access to the media, to raise the consciousness of people about the nature of the threats that we face, and then to galvanize people into action.
Yeah, I mean, talking about the nature of the threats that we face, I mean, these attacks are on Black economic and political power, right? And they are no accident. They're well organized, they're well funded, but like you said, they're also nothing new, and they are also expected. We knew that there was going to be a backlash, after even the 2020 racial reckoning. And in fact, the goal of the NRDC was to get ahead of that backlash. I know many of the organizations were working to get ahead of like the ripple effects of the affirmative action ruling, which we knew was never just about,
Right.
the higher education system. All this work shows that the work is never done, right? That we have to be vigilant about this, certainly something that we know and believe with the 19th. Just as we're holding on to the gains that we made in the last redistricting cycle, for example, we're already looking ahead to the next one. So can you just share some details on what's ahead there?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, this is an ongoing battle. I mean, you can go back as far as Reconstruction.
Yeah.
With every time we make gains, there's a backlash. I mean, Barack Obama is elected president, there's a backlash.
Yeah.
There are nationwide protests about the murder of George Floyd. Interestingly, the Pew poll did a study that said most of the people who were in those marches were white,
Yes.
majority white, but nevertheless, a backlash. And so,
Or maybe, especially because of that, there needed to be a backlash.
exactly.
Yeah.
So what we've got to do, I think, is play the long game. I think that too often we get episodically excited, get all excited about a presidential election and then go back down. Meanwhile, the other side is electing people at the state legislative level, the local level, and putting in place a whole bunch of measures that are inconsistent with the desires of the American people. The reality is that on a day-to-day basis, your life is more impacted by who serves in your state legislature than who serves in Congress. Yeah. You look at all of these anti-choice laws that are being put in place now. These are state legislative things that are going on. People putting in gerrymandered states, putting in place measures to 6-week bans, 15-week bans, whatever they are, not supported by the people necessarily, but they do them because they're in these safe gerrymandered seats and they can do what it is they want. And so we've got to fight for the structural changes that we need. We've got to participate in voting, and we've also got to get companies and corporations involved in this effort as well.
Yeah, and I'm old enough to remember just a few years ago when we were.
I'm clearly old enough to remember. Okay.
I'm just going to keep on pointing that out.
Lincoln was not president when I was born, just to be clear.
He was not. But no, what does the private sector in particular need to do on both of these fronts? There was a point where, the private sector, folks were asking the private sector to be a part of the solution. Folks were trying to hold the private sector accountable on issues of rights and issues of democracy.
Yeah, I think the private sector has got to speak out. There's some bottom line things here. We look at companies and in the same, competitive sphere, and those companies that are more diverse have a better bottom line than the company that is less diverse. There are tons of studies, that show that. So that even on economic grounds, there is the need for companies to be involved in standing up for, protecting, advancing, diversity efforts. Beyond that, businesses always like certainty. Democracy will tend to breed, certainty. Authoritarianism breeds a certain kind of certainty, I suppose, but then you got the authoritarian person picking, or regime, picking winners and losers. And that's not necessarily good for business. But I just think that there's an enormous amount of power that resides in the business community, enormous amount of respect that the business community has, deserved or not, that has to be used in this fight for our democracy.
Okay, yes. So then speak to the leaders in this room. What should they be doing inside their companies and organizations to protect our democracy and our progress? And why, in the fact of these sustained and too often successful attacks, should we remain hopeful about the long-term prognosis?
Well, I think we ought to remain hopeful. Pick up my book, Unfinished March. There's a commercial for you that really kind of traces our history, and when we are committed, focused, we will succeed. It doesn't happen, overnight. We're always making progress. But I'm also old enough at this point to not be satisfied.
I didn't bring it up. I just want
to. Well, now I'm gonna wrap my hands around my age, because I am old enough to think that this notion of being satisfied with progress is no longer satisfactory. My father was born in the 1900s, mother's born in the 1920s, I was born in the 1950s, my kid's born in the 1990s. How long are we supposed to wait? Progress is a marker of kind of where you are at a given time compared to where you were. But when do we get to those end states of equality and justice?
Yes.
And that's, I think, what we need to be fighting for. I don't want people to get in my face and say we've made progress. Things are better now than they were in the 1940s. Okay, so what? They're still not good.
Yeah, right. And also that's the history of our country. Things are supposed to continue to move forward, and we are supposed to continue.
Right. I mean, Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But the reality is it doesn't bend on its own.
Right.
It only bends when people like the folks in this room put their hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And what you got to ask yourself is, what is it that you can do to pull that arc towards justice? What is it that you can do to get your company, the entity that you are connected to, involved in that fight to pull that arc towards justice? This is something that we can do. I mean, our history tells us this. The great social movements in this country didn't happen simply because their time had come. They came because people fought for them. Yeah. The end of slavery, women getting the right to vote, the 19th Amendment. That didn't just happen.
Right.
It was called women organized, sacrificed, and made it happen. The Civil Rights Movement. Dr. King, John Lewis, Diane Nash, they ripped down a system of American apartheid. And I'm sure they must have thought at some point, do we have the ability to do this? Just kind of average people. And the other thing is that young people need to understand that every great social movement in this country has been led by young people. The founding of this country was done by people in their 30s. The only old, by comparison, the only old founding father was Benjamin Franklin. Everybody else was like in their 20s and 30s. And so young people need to understand they have the capacity for taking this nation to a better place.
Yeah, you're making such a good point about the reality that progress does require all of us, right? It requires all of us in this room today, working across sectors, across industries, across everything, right? Across this democracy, and that we have to be vigilant about these things, and that we do, to your point, have a blueprint in the history of this country. We know how to win. We just need to get everybody to do their part, right? But I think you're right. Part of that does require a shift in thinking. I'm not a civil rights activist, or I'm not a government official. What role can I play? That was not how folks in the civil rights movement or after after slavery, that was not how they thought. They got involved because they wanted to be part of what it meant to get us to a freer and fairer and more equal society, right?
See, I think that's right. Every person in this room today, and anybody who's listening in through the magic of virtual stuff, every one of you is a potential civil rights worker and potential civil rights leader. And you have to understand, you got to believe that. Pessimism, I think, leads to inaction. Optimism, I think, breeds commitment. And there is a historical base for the optimism that I, continue to feel. Yeah. We have to understand our history, know the capacities that we have as so-called ordinary citizens. And if we know that history and have that optimism, we can bring about change. But again, I'm not satisfied with progress. That ain't enough. That's not enough anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, we know that, Black women certainly a very loyal and consistent voting base, but that's not the way that everybody is approaching voting, especially headed into this year. We have, we talk a lot in the political press about voter enthusiasm, but we know that as a country, voter turnout is not anywhere near where it should be, especially as we are headed into this year facing a serious threat to democracy. Certainly something that I know you believe, and certainly something that we say at the 19th, is that democracy is not a spectator sport, right? So how do we demonstrate to corporate leaders kind of how and where they can weigh in? So they've decided, okay, yes, I hear you, I'm taking up the call that you're making. How can they weigh in to make sure that Black economic power is not further curtailed, if that is the thing that gets them to want to be more involved?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of ways I think that corporations can support, this democracy effort. I think about, the folks who own the Coliseum or whatever it's called in Atlanta and opened it up and made that a place where people could come and vote, so to the extent that you have the ability to, you have entities, you have buildings or whatever that could be turned into polling places.
Yes.
I mean, that's, one tangible thing. Allowing workers, personnel, time off to organize, or even to vote.
To vote, yes.
Even just to vote, so that you don't have to decide between your job and your ability to participate in this democracy.
Especially in the South, where most Black people live, and where we're seeing voter suppression legislation being passed to make it more difficult for people.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, companies have to decide where you're going to hold your annual meetings and things like, don't go to places that make it more difficult to vote. There's a whole range of places that you can go in this country, if you, warm weather, cold weather, whatever it is that you want to do, that are doing things consistent with the ideals of this nation, that is to let people vote, let people participate, as opposed to places that are just making it more difficult for American citizens to exercise that most fundamental of rights, and that's the right to vote. So, vote with the money, the economic power that you have, and push the political class to do, to do the right thing.
Yeah, well, that is definitely why the Black Economic Alliance and events like this are so important. And because you have this incredible brain trust here that has really kind of come together, not just to talk, but to act, right? And so that is the charge going forth from here to confront this attack on Black progress. And we know that central to that attack is an attack on our ability to participate in this democracy. And so thank you so much for being here.
One thing.
Yes.
We got to act, though. It's not enough for us to have this great conference led by this wonderfully intelligent woman. You all should know about the 19th. She's doing great stuff at the 19th. But you can't leave here feeling good about, well, it was a great talk and all that. We took some notes. The question is, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? A week from now, a couple of months from now, and in the weeks before November the 5th, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Every person here should come up with some kind of plan about how you're going to get involved in this fight for our democracy. The choices are stark. And I don't care what it is you think about, I'm just be partisan now, about Joe Biden, Democrats, and promises unkept. Okay, there are legitimate concerns that can be expressed there, but the alternative, anybody who thinks, as an African American, who thinks that the alternative is better, you're out of your goddamn minds, If you think that this Supreme Court that has done away with affirmative action, you think they're done? No. They will be emboldened by a Trump victory. And so ask yourself, what are you going to do? Come up with a plan, involve other people, and then get out there and change the world.
Yeah. Well, the couch is also the alternative, by the way, which we do not want people to choose. So thank you very much.
Okay.
We will end that on that note. Thank y'all so much for listening.
Okay.